Three massive bodies pin her against silk sheets, and Seraphina realizes with terrifying clarity that her virgin body cannot possibly accommodate what they're demanding. The first knot swells inside her, stretching her beyond reason, and she sobs as the second alpha positions himself. They promised to be gentle. They lied. Her untouched flesh tears as the second knot forces entry, and the third brother watches with hungry silver eyes waiting his turn. The pressure builds to something impossible, something her small omega frame was never meant to endure. She can feel them both now locked deep inside her, their knots swelling larger with each passing second. "Please," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I can't take another. There's no room." Cassian's dark eyes gleam in the candlelight as he positions himself at her entrance, where his brother Lysander is already buried to the hilt. His voice is rough with barely restrained hunger when he speaks. "Your omega body was made for this, Seraphina. Made to take all three of us at once. Trust us." The third penetration begins, and Seraphina screams. Silver light explodes from her skin like a star going supernova. The entire bedroom floods with radiance so bright it burns away shadows, so pure it seems to come from another world entirely. Power rolls through her in waves that make the stone walls tremble. The three alphas freeze locked inside her, their eyes wide with shock and something that might be fear. Her voice when it comes doesn't sound like her own. It echoes with the weight of centuries, with the authority of the divine. The moon-blessed are not extinct. We merely waited for the right time. Then everything goes black. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Now let's get into it. 3 months earlier, the rejection ceremony was scheduled for sunset, a traditional time for omega bondings, and Seraphina Winterborn had spent the entire day trying not to vomit from sheer terror. She stood in her childhood bedroom for what she knew would be the last time, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror that had belonged to her mother. The glass was old enough that it distorted her features slightly, making her look even paler than usual, even more otherworldly. Platinum blonde hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of moonlight. Her eyes were the color of violets in twilight, so pale they appeared almost translucent in certain lights. The combination made her look ethereal, delicate, like something carved from ice and starlight rather than flesh and bone. The pack called it a curse. Thaddeus Ashcroft had promised to overlook it. The wedding gown they had dressed her in was traditional white, cut low enough to display the unmarked skin of her shoulders and throat. By midnight, those shoulders would bear an alpha's claiming bite. By dawn, she would be bound forever to the man who had courted her since she turned 18, who had promised her father that her unusual coloring wouldn't matter, that he saw past the superstition to the omega beneath. Seraphina wanted desperately to believe him. She was 20 years old, a virgin omega, from a fallen noble family, and in exactly 2 hours she would belong to Thaddeus Ashcroft, head councilman of the Northern Territories, one of the most powerful alphas in the entire pack structure. Her father stood by the window of their crumbling estate, refusing to meet her eyes, and Seraphina understood why. Richard Winterborn had gambled away everything. The family fortune, built over generations of careful stewardship, had vanished into cards and dice and bottles of imported whiskey. The estate was mortgaged 3 times over. Debt collectors came weekly now, their patience wearing thinner with each visit. This mating would save them. Thaddeus had promised to clear the debts, to restore the Winterborn name, to ensure that her father could live out his remaining years in comfort rather than shame. All it cost was Seraphina's future, her autonomy, and any choice she might have had about who she wanted to spend eternity with. "You should feel honored," her father said without turning around, his voice carrying the hollow conviction of a man trying to convince himself he hadn't just committed an unforgivable betrayal. "Thaddeus Ashcroft is powerful and respected. Any omega would be thrilled to be chosen by him." Seraphina wanted to scream that she wasn't any omega, that she had dreams and desires that didn't include being bound to a man twice her age who looked at her like a prized possession rather than a person. But she had learned long ago that her wants meant nothing in a world where omegas were valued primarily for their ability to bear strong children and strengthen pack alliances. The carriage that came to collect her was ornate and expensive, drawn by 4 black horses that stamped and snorted in the winter air. The drive to the sacred grove took 40 minutes through increasingly wild territory, and with each mile that passed, Seraphina felt the last threads of her old life slipping away. The ceremony would take place in the Great Clearing, where the Northern Territories had conducted omega bondings for over 300 years. Ancient trees surrounded the space, their branches forming a natural cathedral overhead. Torches had been placed in a wide circle, their flames dancing in the evening breeze, and hundreds of witnesses from across the territories had gathered to watch. Seraphina's legs shook as she walked the long path alone, her father having chosen to arrive separately, unable to face what he had done. The crowd watched her progress with expressions ranging from pity to approval to poorly hidden disgust. She could hear the whispers as she passed. Cursed Omega. Dark moon marked. Poor councilman binding himself to that. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, and forced herself to keep walking. One foot in front of the other. Don't stumble. Don't cry. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing how much their words cut. And then she saw him, Thaddeus, waiting at the altar, and something cold settled in her stomach. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of powerful build that came from good genetics and regular training. His dark hair was shot through with silver at the temples, giving him a distinguished look that many found attractive. At 35, he was in his prime, wealthy and influential, exactly the kind of alpha most Omegas dreamed of bonding. But his eyes were cold as he watched her approach, calculating, assessing her like one might evaluate livestock at market. Seraphina had seen that look before in the eyes of wolves who measured worth in bloodlines and breeding potential rather than hearts and souls. She had convinced herself it would change after the bonding, that once they were mated, he would soften, that she could learn to love him, or at least find contentment in the life they would build together. Now, with 50 feet left to walk and his gaze tracking her every step with the precision of a predator, she wasn't so sure. The high priest waited between them, an ancient beta whose family had officiated bonding ceremonies since before anyone could remember. He smiled at Seraphina with genuine warmth as she reached the altar, and she clung to that small kindness like a lifeline. Dearly beloved, the priest began, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced ease. We are gathered under the light of the full moon to witness the sacred bonding of Omega and Alpha, the joining of two souls into one eternal partnership. The traditional words washed over Seraphina like a tide she couldn't fight. She heard herself respond at the appropriate moments, felt her hand placed in Thaddeus's larger one, watched as if from a great distance as the ceremony progressed exactly as it had for centuries. Do you, Seraphina Winterborn, take this Alpha as your bonded mate to serve and honor to bear his children and strengthen his line for as long as you both shall live? This was it, the point of no return. Once she spoke the words, she would be bound by pack law and sacred tradition. There would be no escape, no reprieve, no miracle to save her from a future she had never chosen. Seraphina opened her mouth to say the words that would seal her fate. Thaddeus's hand tightened on hers hard enough to hurt, and something in her rebelled. She started, then stopped. The crowd shifted, murmuring. The priest looked concerned. Thaddeus's expression darkened, his fingers crushing hers in warning. I need a moment, Seraphina whispered. You don't get a moment, Thaddeus hissed low enough that only she could hear. Say the words, Omega, now. The command in his voice was pure alpha dominance, the kind that could force compliance from lesser wolves. Seraphina felt her Omega nature respond instinctively, felt the urge to submit rising in her throat like bile. But beneath the fear and the trained obedience, something else stirred. Something that refused to bend. Something that looked at this powerful alpha, trying to force her compliance, and said no. She tried again, and Thaddeus made his decision. He released her hand and stepped back, his face transforming from irritation to cold fury in the space between heartbeats. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire clearing, ensuring every witness heard clearly. I, Thaddeus Ashcroft, hereby reject Seraphina Winterborn as my mate. The world stopped. Seraphina stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Reject. He was rejecting her, in front of 500 witnesses, at their own bonding ceremony. This Omega, Thaddeus continued, his voice dripping with disdain, is cursed. Her coloring is a mark of the dark moon, a stain upon any bloodline foolish enough to accept her. I will not bind myself to defective breeding, stock no matter how desperate her father's debts. Each word landed like a physical blow. Seraphina felt her knees start to buckle, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on her, felt the familiar shame of being found wanting rising up to choke her. Furthermore, Thaddeus said, turning to address the crowd rather than her, I announce my intention to bond with Marianne Silverpaw, whose proven fertility and unblemished lineage make her a worthy mate for a councilman of my standing. A beautiful brunette, Omega stepped forward from the crowd, her smile triumphant. She had been there all along, Seraphina realized with sick understanding. This had been planned. Thaddeus had never intended to go through with the bonding. He had brought her here in front of everyone specifically to reject her as publicly and humiliatingly as possible. But why? The priest looked horrified. Councilman, this is highly irregular. The Omega's family has already. The Omega's family sold her on false pretenses, Thaddeus interrupted smoothly. They claimed pure bloodline failed to disclose the obvious defect. The contract is void. Serafina found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she wanted. You knew about my coloring from the start. You've known for 2 years. Thaddeus finally looked at her again, and the cruelty in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. I knew your father was desperate enough to accept any terms. I knew humiliating you publicly would ensure no other alpha ever risks his reputation trying to bond cursed goods. And I knew that breaking you here in front of everyone would serve as an excellent reminder of what happens to Omegas who think they can hesitate when given a command. Understanding crashed over her like ice water. This wasn't about bloodlines or curses or breeding potential. This was about power. She had hesitated, had shown the slightest hint of resistance, and he had destroyed her for it as an example to others. The crowd's whispers had grown to a roar. Serafina could feel their judgment, their pity, their disgust washing over her in waves. Some looked at her with sympathy, but most simply looked away, unwilling to be associated with an Omega who had been so thoroughly rejected. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the forest and never be seen again, wanted to cease existing rather than face the reality of what had just happened. But Serafina Winterborn was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her that dignity was something you maintained even when everything else was stripped away. So she lifted her chin, met Thaddeus's cold gaze with her own, and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Then I suppose the moon goddess chose wrong. Or perhaps, and here she let her voice sharpen just slightly, she knew exactly what she was doing when she made me hesitate. It wasn't much of a victory. It wouldn't undo the humiliation or erase the rejection or restore her family's honor. But it was something, a small act of defiance that said she would not be completely broken no matter how hard they tried. Thaddeus's expression flickered with something that might have been respect or might have been fury. Then he turned his back on her, claimed Marianne's hand, and repeated the ceremony with the Omega, who had been waiting in the wings all along. Serafina stood there for the first few minutes, unable to make herself move. But as the new bonding progressed, as Thaddeus spoke the words to another that should have been for her, she finally forced her frozen limbs into motion. She walked back down the long path alone, through a crowd that parted before her like she carried plague. No one met her eyes. No one offered comfort. She was rejected Omega, now marked as unworthy, cursed and defective, and forever tainted by public humiliation. The carriage that had brought her was gone. She would have to walk the 10 miles back to the Winterborn estate in her ceremonial gown and thin slippers through winter woods that grew colder and darker with each passing minute. Serafina gathered her skirts, took a deep breath of freezing air, and started walking. She made it half a mile before the tears finally came. But she didn't stop moving. Couldn't stop. Because if she stopped, if she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, she wasn't sure she would ever be able to stand again. The moon rose full and bright overhead, illuminating her path through the forest. Serafina looked up at it once at the silver disk that was supposed to represent the goddesses who blessed Omegas and guided their fates. Some blessing, she whispered to the uncaring sky. The moon offered no response. It never did. By the time Serafina reached the Winterborn estate, her feet were bleeding inside her ruined slippers, and she was shaking so hard from cold that her teeth chattered. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in her father's study. She found him there, passed out drunk across his desk, an empty bottle beside him. On the desk lay a stack of papers marked with red ink. Final notices, foreclosure warnings, demands for immediate payment. Without the Ashcroft alliance, they were finished. Serafina stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the man who had sold her to save himself, who couldn't even stay sober long enough to see what his bargain had cost. She felt nothing. The tears had dried during the long walk home, and now there was just emptiness where her future used to be. She went to her room, stripped off the ceremonial gown, and burned it in the fireplace. The white silk caught quickly, flames consuming the fabric that was supposed to have marked the beginning of her bonded life. Instead, it marked the end of everything she had been foolish enough to hope for. Rejected Omega, cursed bloodline, defective goods. The words circled in her mind as she watched the dress turn to ash. This was her reality now. No alpha would want her after such a public rejection. Her family was ruined financially. Her father had no other assets to trade, no other options to pursue. They would lose the estate within the month. Her father would likely drink himself to death. And Serafina would be left alone, marked as unwanted, forced to survive however she could in a world that had no use for rejected Omegas. Unless The thought came to her as the last flames died down, as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky outside her window. There was one place that would take her, one market that didn't care about public rejections or cursed bloodlines or anything beyond basic fertility. It was shameful, degrading, the absolute last resort of desperate Omegas with nowhere else to turn. But it would clear her father's debts. It would ensure he had enough to live on. And it would put Serafina somewhere far away from the northern territories, far from the whispers and the pity and the constant reminder of her humiliation. The Omega market operated in the remote mountains far from civilized packlands, in a place where traditional laws held less sway. Packs came there to acquire Omegas they couldn't obtain through normal channels. Some were looking for rare bloodlines, some wanted proven fertility, some just wanted warm bodies to fill empty pack positions, and some were looking for virgins, no matter how cursed. Serafina waited until her father woke sick and shaking from the previous night's drinking. She waited until he saw her, saw what his bargain had cost, saw the ashes of her wedding dress still warm in the fireplace. Then she made her offer. "I'll go to the Omega market, willingly. Whatever price I bring you, use it to clear the debts and live comfortably. In return, you never contact me again. You forget you had a daughter. You let me disappear." Richard Winterbourne looked at her with bloodshot eyes, and for just a moment she saw genuine grief in his expression. But it wasn't enough to make him refuse. It was never enough. "If that's what you want," he said quietly. "It's not what I want," Serafina replied, her voice steady despite the scream building in her chest. "It's what's necessary. There's a difference." The arrangements took 6 days. 6 days of watching her father sober up enough to handle the logistics of packing what few possessions she wanted to keep, of saying goodbye to the only home she had ever known. On the 7th day, a transport carriage arrived. It was unmarked, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that could pass through packed territories without drawing attention. The beta driver barely looked at her as she climbed inside. The journey to the Omega market took 3 days of hard travel through increasingly wild country. Serafina spent the time in silence, watching the familiar landscapes of her childhood give way to harsh mountain wilderness she had never seen before. On the 3rd night they arrived. The Omega market. The Omega market wasn't what Serafina had imagined. She had pictured something squalid and shameful hidden away in darkness, like the dirty secret it was. Instead, she found herself standing in an ancient stone amphitheater carved directly into the mountainside, open to the sky, and surrounded by towering pines that had witnessed centuries of these transactions. Moonlight flooded the space, turning the pale stone silvery white. Torches burned in iron sconces around the perimeter, their flames dancing in the cold wind that swept down from the peaks above. The architecture was old, far older than any pack structure Serafina had seen, with symbols carved into the stone that predated modern wolf packs entirely. This place had been sacred, once she realized. Before it became a market for desperate Omegas, it had been something else, something holy. Now it was where wolves came to buy what they couldn't claim through proper channels. 32 Omegas stood in a line along the amphitheater's edge, waiting. Most were young, between 18 and 25, though a few were older, their desperation written in the lines around their eyes. Some had been rejected, like Serafina. Some were fleeing abusive packs. Some were simply orphans with no family to arrange proper bondings. All of them were trying not to look as terrified as they felt. A stern-looking female beta moved down the line, checking each Omega's documentation and assigning them numbers. When she reached Serafina, her eyes widened slightly at the platinum hair and violet eyes. But she said nothing, merely marked something on her clipboard and moved on. "Number 27, the beta announced, handing Serafina a small bronze token with the number etched into it. The Omegas were led to a preparation room carved into the rock itself, where they were given simple white shifts to wear and told to remove any jewelry or personal items. Everything had to be neutral, unmarked, allowing the bidders to focus solely on the Omega themselves, rather than any trappings of wealth or status. Serafina stripped mechanically, folding her traveling clothes with careful precision and placing them in the wooden chest provided. The white shift was thin, nearly transparent in places, designed to showcase rather than conceal. She forced herself not to think about what came next, not to imagine the eyes that would evaluate her, the voices that would assign her a price. First time, the voice came from the Omega beside her, a petite brunette with kind brown eyes and a nervous smile. She looked barely 18, her youth still evident in the softness of her features. "Yes," Serafina admitted quietly. "Me too." The girl offered her hand. "I'm Clara, number 26, so we'll be next to each other out there." Serafina took the offered hand, grateful for even this small gesture of solidarity. "Serafina, number 27. Your hair, Clara said, wonder creeping into her voice. It's beautiful, like starlight. It's a curse, Serafina replied automatically, the words so familiar they came without thought. Clara's expression shifted to something that might have been pity or might have been understanding. Maybe to some, but there are packs that value unusual traits that see them as marks of power rather than defects. You might bring a better price than you think. The words were meant to be comforting, but they made Serafina's stomach turn. A better price. As if she were cattle being evaluated for slaughter, her worth measured in gold pieces rather than anything that actually mattered. But this was the choice she had made. This was the path she had chosen to save her father from the consequences of his own weakness. She couldn't afford to falter now. The beta returned, clapping her hands sharply. Listen carefully. You will be presented to the assembled packs in numerical order. You will stand on your platform and remain silent unless directly addressed. The packs will bid through their designated representatives. When bidding closes on your lot, you will be escorted to a holding area where you will await your purchaser. Purchaser, not mate, not bond partner. Purchaser. Some packs will want to examine you before finalizing their bids. The beta continued, her tone matter of fact. You will submit to reasonable inspection. You have the right to refuse anything invasive or degrading, though such refusal may impact your final price. A small mercy, then. They could still say no to the worst indignities, even if it meant being worth less in the end. Any questions? No one spoke. What was there to ask? They all knew why they were here, knew what they had agreed to by coming. Questions wouldn't change the fundamental reality of their situation. Then we begin. The first Omega, a slight blonde girl who couldn't have been more than 19, was led out into the amphitheater. Through the stone archway, Serafina could see her climb onto a raised platform in the center of the space illuminated by torchlight and moonbeams. She could hear the murmur of voices as the assembled packs evaluated her, could hear the beta announcer listing her qualities in the same tone one might use to describe breeding livestock. Omega designation proven fertile through heat cycles, no prior bonding, age 19, willing to relocate to any territory. The bidding started at 5,000 gold pieces. Serafina closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of numbers climbing higher, trying not to imagine herself standing on that platform while strangers decided what she was worth. But there was no escape from it. This was happening. This was real. One by one, the Omegas were called. One by one, they walked through that archway and into the arena where their fates would be decided by whoever bid highest. Some brought modest prices, 10 or 12,000 gold. Others sparked fierce bidding wars that drove their value up to 20 or even 25,000. When they called number 26, Clara squeezed Serafina's hand once before letting go and walking through the archway with her head held high. Serafina watched her disappear into the torchlight and tried to find that same courage in herself. She'll do well, an older Omega said softly from behind her. She's pretty and young and looks sweet, exactly what most packs want. And what would they see when they looked at Serafina? A cursed Omega with unnatural coloring and a public rejection in her recent past, or something valuable enough to justify the risk, number 27. The beta's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. This was it. No more time to prepare to brace herself to find courage she didn't possess. Serafina walked through the archway and into the amphitheater. The moonlight hit her like a physical force so bright after the dimness of the preparation room that she had to blink several times before her eyes adjusted. The amphitheater was larger than she had realized, capable of holding hundreds of witnesses, and tonight it was nearly full. Wolves from dozens of packs filled the stone seats, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their attention fixed on the platform where she was meant to stand. The air was thick with alpha pheromones, so many powerful wolves in one place that the atmosphere felt charged, electric, dangerous. Serafina climbed the 3 steps to the platform on legs that threatened to give out beneath her. The stone was cold under her bare feet. The white shift offered no protection from the wind or from the weight of hundreds of evaluating stares. She stood in the center of the platform and lifted her chin, refusing to cower. If she was going to be sold like livestock, she would at least maintain what dignity she could. The beta announcer's voice rang out across the amphitheater. Lot 27, Omega designation virgin, age 20, no prior bonding, Northern Territories bloodline, willing to relocate. A pause, and then the words that would define her in the eyes of every wolf present. Notable characteristics include rare platinum coloring and violet eyes. Potential moon-blessed markers, though unverified. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some wolves leaned forward with sudden interest. Others muttered among themselves, clearly suspicious of the coloring that had marked her as cursed all her life. A few actually stood as if getting closer might help them determine whether she was valuable or defective. Bidding opens at 5,000 gold pieces. For a long moment, nothing happened. Serafina stood alone on the platform illuminated by moon and torchlight and felt the awful weight of rejection settling over her again. Even here, even at the Omega market where desperate packs came to find Omegas they couldn't obtain elsewhere, no one wanted her. Then a voice called out from the eastern section of seats. 7,000! The bid was low, almost insulting, but it broke the silence. A second voice, this one from the west, countered immediately. 10,000. In 12,000 came a third bid. The numbers began to climb slowly at first, then with increasing speed as more packs joined the bidding. Serafina tried to focus on anything other than the fact that her worth was being calculated in real time by strangers who saw her as an acquisition rather than a person. She let her gaze drift upward to the stars visible beyond the amphitheater's open roof. The moon was full tonight, the same moon that had witnessed her rejection 7 days ago, the same moon that was supposed to bless Omegas and guide their paths. 20,000, someone called and the crowd murmured. That was a significant sum, more than many Omegas brought, even with proven fertility and unblemished lineages. 22,000. 25,000. The bidding had narrowed to 3 voices now, 3 packs still competing. Serafina couldn't see their faces from where she stood, couldn't identify who wanted her badly enough to pay such prices. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. 30,000 gold pieces. The voice was new, sharp, and cold, coming from the northern section of seats. Serafina's eyes snapped to the source despite herself, and her blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. A figure stood in the shadows at the edge of the amphitheater, too far back to be clearly visible, but close enough that she could make out the general shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, radiating the kind of power that made lesser wolves instinctively submit. 35,000, another voice countered quickly, as if trying to outbid before the first bidder could respond. 40,000. The cold voice again, and this time there was something in it that made Serafina's skin prickle with unease. She knew who it was. Even without seeing his face, even across the vast space of the amphitheater, she recognized Thaddeus Ashcroft's voice. He was here. The alpha who had rejected her publicly, who had humiliated her in front of her entire pack, who had called her cursed and defective and unworthy. He was here bidding on her, driving her price higher with every call. But why the bidding continued, but Serafina barely heard it. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what Thaddeus could possibly want with her. Revenge, some sick satisfaction in owning the Omega he had rejected, a way to ensure she could never escape the shadow of his condemnation. 45,000. 48,000. The prices had climbed absurdly high now, far beyond what even the most desirable Omegas typically brought. Someone in the crowd laughed nervously, as if unsure whether this was serious or some elaborate joke. And then a voice spoke from the southern section, a voice so deep and resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. 50,000 gold pieces. The entire amphitheater went silent. Serafina's head whipped toward the source of the voice, and her breath caught in her throat. 3 figures stood together in the highest tier of seats, silhouetted against the night sky. Even from a distance, even in shadow, she could tell they were massive, their builds identical, their presence overwhelming. The beta announcer looked stunned, her clipboard momentarily forgotten. 50,000 gold pieces was an unheard-of sum, more than the previous record by nearly double. For a long moment, she seemed unable to speak. Finally, she recovered her composure. 50,000 gold from the Blackthorn delegation. Do I hear 55? Silence. Even Thaddeus, wherever he was hiding in the darkness, seemed unwilling to go higher. 50,000 gold pieces was a fortune enough to buy, not just an Omega, but an entire estate, enough to fund a small pack for years. 50,000 once, the announcer called. Serafina stared at the 3 figures in the southern section, trying to make out details in the darkness. Who were they? What pack could afford such a sum? And why in the name of the moon goddess would they pay it for her 50,000 twice? The figures didn't move, didn't speak again. They simply stood there, watching her with an intensity she could feel even across the distance. Sold? The announcer's voice cracked slightly on the word. Lot 27 sold to the Blackthorn delegation for 50,000 gold pieces. The crowd erupted into chaos. Wolves were standing, shouting, demanding to know who the Blackthorn delegation represented. The name was familiar to Serafina, something she had heard whispered in her father's study when he thought she wasn't listening, but she couldn't place it. The beta who had checked them in earlier appeared at the platform's edge, her expression carefully neutral. Come with me, please. Serafina's legs felt numb as she descended the platform steps. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The bidding was supposed to end with some remote pack claiming her some strangers she would never see again, taking her far from the Northern Territories where she could start over in anonymity. Instead, she had just been sold for a record-breaking price to mysterious buyers whose very name made the assembled wolves whisper and stare. The beta led her through a side passage carved into the rock away from the main amphitheater and deeper into the mountain. They passed other Omegas, waiting in smaller chambers, their faces curious and envious as they saw Seraphina being led past. 50,000, Clara whispered as they passed her chamber. By the goddess Sarah. Who are they? I don't know, Seraphina admitted, her voice hollow. The beta said nothing, just kept walking until they reached a more luxurious chamber at the end of the passage. This room had actual furniture, a proper bed, even a fireplace burning with real wood, rather than the simple braziers in the other chambers. Wait here, the beta instructed. Your purchasers will arrive shortly to finalize the transaction and collect you. Who are they? Seraphina asked, finally giving voice to the question burning in her mind. The beta's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy or might have been fear. The Blackthorn Triplets. Alpha Kings of the Royal Pack, rulers of the Northern Territory's highest seat of power. The words hit Seraphina like a physical blow. The Royal Pack, the Triplets. Stories about them were legendary, whispered in the same tones people used for myths and fairy tales. They were said to be the most powerful alphas born in 3 centuries, identical triplets, who shared a bond so deep they could sense each other's thoughts and emotions. They had ruled the Northern Territories with absolute authority for over a decade, answering to no council and bowing to no other pack. They were also said to be impossibly selective about Omegas, refusing every potential mate presented to them for the past 200 years. The pack had begun to worry the bloodline would die out, that the triplets would never find an Omega worthy of bearing their heirs, and they had just spent 50,000 gold pieces to purchase her. I don't understand, Seraphina whispered. Why would they want me? The beta shook her head. That's not my concern. My job is to verify the transaction and ensure you're delivered safely to your new pack. She paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, the Blackthorn Triplets are known to be honorable. Harsh, but fair. They don't mistreat their pack members. Small comfort given that Seraphina was now property rather than a pack member. The beta left, closing the door behind her. Seraphina stood alone in the luxurious chamber and tried to process what had just happened. She had come here to disappear, to be sold to some remote pack where she could live out her days in anonymity. Instead, she had been purchased by the most powerful alphas in all the Northern Territories for a price that would make her infamous. There would be no anonymity now, no quiet obscurity. Whatever came next would be public and scrutinized and impossible to escape. The door opened again and Seraphina's breath caught. 3 men entered the chamber, and even though she had known they were triplets, the reality of seeing them together was still overwhelming. They were absolutely identical in height and build, each standing well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of powerful physiques that came from centuries of pure alpha genetics. Their presence filled the room, making the spacious chamber suddenly feel small and cramped. But their coloring was different enough to tell them apart. The first had hair black as midnight and eyes the color of polished silver. He moved with predatory grace, each step calculated and precise, radiating the kind of authority that came from being obeyed without question. The second had golden brown hair that caught the firelight and eyes like amber, warm and intense. His movements were more aggressive, less controlled, as if he was constantly restraining impulses toward violence or passion. The third had hair so pale it was almost white platinum, like Seraphina's own, and eyes the color of glacial ice. He moved with quiet deliberation, watching everything with an analytical gaze that seemed to catalog and assess every detail. All 3 wore formal black clothing that spoke of wealth and power, with silver embroidery at the collars and cuffs that marked them as royalty. All 3 wore expressions of intense focus as they looked at her, and all 3 stopped dead in the doorway, their bodies going rigid as if they had been struck. The air in the room changed, thickened, became charged with something Seraphina couldn't identify but could feel prickling across her skin like static electricity before a lightning strike. The dark-haired one recovered first, though his silver eyes had gone wide with shock. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been in the amphitheater, as if something had caught in his throat. Impossible. The golden-haired one made a sound low in his chest, almost a growl. The bond. I can feel it. The pale-haired one simply stared at Seraphina with those ice-colored eyes, his expression unreadable, but his body language screaming tension. Seraphina took an involuntary step backward. What's happening? The dark-haired alpha moved into the room fully, the door closing behind his brothers. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell him now. Pine and winter storms, and something wild that made her Omega nature respond with a flutter of awareness she absolutely did not want to feel. "My name is Cassian Blackthorn," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite whatever had just shocked him. "These are my brothers, Dorian and Lysander. And you, Seraphina Winterborn, are our true mate." The words made no sense. True mate was a concept from old stories, from legends about the moon goddess, matching souls together before they were even born. It wasn't real, it was romantic fantasy, nothing more. "That's not possible," Seraphina said, echoing Cassian's own first words. "True mates are myths." "We thought so too," the golden-haired one, Dorian said. His amber eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "We've waited 200 years, rejected every Omega presented to us because none of them triggered the bond. We thought it would never happen. And then we saw you standing on that platform," Lysander added, his cool voice at odds with the heat in his ice-colored eyes. "The bond snapped into place so hard it nearly drove us to our knees in front of 500 witnesses." Seraphina shook her head, trying to deny what they were saying, even as her own body betrayed her with responses she didn't understand. She could smell them now. All three of them, their scents mingling into something that made her head swim and her core clench with unfamiliar heat. "You bought me," she said, grasping for the reality of the situation. "I'm purchased property. You can't have a true mate bond with property." Cassian's expression darkened. "The purchase was necessary to claim you before anyone else could. The bond doesn't change the fact that we own you legally, but it does change how we intended to use you." "How you intended to use me," Seraphina repeated, and something in her chest twisted painfully. Even true mates, if such a thing existed, apparently saw her as a tool to be used. "Poor choice of words," Lysander said quietly. "What my brother means is that we came here tonight looking to acquire an Omega for practical purposes. Heirs, primarily. The pack requires continuation of our bloodline. But now that we know you're our true mate," Dorian continued, taking a step closer, "everything has changed." "Has it?" Seraphina challenged, finding courage in anger. "I'm still here against my will. Still sold to clear my father's debts. Still bound by a contract I signed under duress. The only thing that's changed is that you're apparently stuck with me because of some mystical bond I can't even feel." All three alphas went very still. "You can't feel it?" Cassian asked carefully. Seraphina wanted to lie, wanted to deny the pull she had felt the moment they entered the room, the way her Omega nature had perked up with interest, despite her conscious mind screaming danger. But something in his tone made her hesitate. "I feel something," she admitted reluctantly, "but it could just be fear, or the fact that you're three powerful alphas and I'm a rejected Omega trapped in a room with you." Dorian made that growling sound again, and Seraphina flinched despite herself. He noticed immediately his expression shifting to something that might have been regret. "We're not going to hurt you," he said, his voice gentling slightly. "Whatever else happens, you need to understand that." "You bought me for 50,000 gold pieces," Seraphina replied. "You expect heirs. You just admitted the bond makes me your true mate, which means you'll want to claim me. How exactly does that not end with you hurting me?" The three brothers exchanged glances, that eerie communication that came from their shared bond evident in the way they seemed to reach consensus without speaking. Cassian turned back to her, his silver eyes serious. "You're right that we expect heirs. That was part of the contract you signed. But we're not savages. We don't force ourselves on unwilling Omega's true mate or not." "Then what do you want from me?" Seraphina asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "We want you to give us a chance," Lysander said simply. "Come to our territory. Live in our home. Let us prove that we can be worthy of you before you make your final judgment about what we are. And if I refuse, then we'll find you a place in the pack that doesn't require bonding." Cassian said, though something in his expression suggested the words cost him. "The contract requires you to produce heirs, yes. But there are ways to accomplish that without a mating bond, without claiming bites, without forcing intimacy you don't want." Artificial insemination, he meant. Clinical and cold and utterly devoid of the connection that true mates were supposed to share. Seraphina looked at the three of them, these powerful alpha kings, who had just upended her understanding of reality and tried to find clarity in the chaos of her thoughts. She had come here expecting to be sold to strangers. Instead, she had been claimed by the most powerful alphas in the territories who insisted she was their true mate. She had expected cruelty and indifference. Instead, they were offering her a choice, limited though it was. But beneath the pretty words and unexpected gentleness, The fundamental truth remained unchanged. She was still purchased property, still bound by a contract she had signed in desperation, still trapped in a situation she had never wanted and couldn't escape. "How long?" she asked finally. "How long what?" Dorian replied. "How long do I have to decide to give you this chance you're asking for?" The brothers exchanged another one of those silent communications. When Cassian spoke, his voice was careful. "We leave for Blackthorn Manor in the morning. The journey takes 3 days. We would ask that you give us at least those 3 days to prove we're not the monsters you think we are." 3 days. Serafina could survive 3 days of anything. And after 3 days, we discuss the terms of our arrangement more permanently, Cassian said. "Either you'll be willing to explore the Mount Bond and what it means, or we'll make alternative arrangements that satisfy the contract without requiring your participation beyond what's medically necessary." It wasn't much of a choice, but it was more than she had expected, more than the Omega market typically offered. Serafina took a deep breath and met Cassian's silver gaze directly. "I agree to 3 days, but I want your word, all three of you, that you won't force anything I'm not ready to give." "You have it," Cassian said immediately. "On my honor," Dorian added. "By the moon goddess herself," Lysander finished. The vow settled over the room like a physical weight binding in the way that promises between wolves always were. They couldn't break their word now, not without sacrificing their honor and the respect of every wolf who heard of it. It should have made Serafina feel safer. Instead, it just made her more aware of how much power they held, that even their promises felt like chains binding her to a future she hadn't chosen. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "I should pack for a 3-day journey." "Everything has been arranged," Lysander said. "You'll want for nothing at Blackthorn Manor." Of course they had already arranged everything. They had probably planned this entire encounter before they ever arrived at the Omega market, had known exactly what they would say and how they would handle a reluctant purchased mate. Serafina was so tired of being managed, of having every aspect of her life controlled by others. But she was also realistic enough to know that fighting wouldn't change her circumstances. She had signed the contract. She had agreed to come. The path forward was set whether she wanted it or not. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Dawn," Cassian replied. "We'll send servants to help you prepare." They left then, filing out of the chamber with a last lingering look that made Serafina's skin prickle with awareness. The door closed behind them, and she was alone again, with her racing thoughts and the scent of 3 alphas that seemed to cling to the air. True mates. It should have been romantic, fated, the kind of thing Omegas dreamed about. Instead, it felt like one more chain binding her to a future she couldn't escape, but one more way the moon goddess had decided to make her life complicated beyond bearing. Serafina sank onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She had no tears left after the past 7 days, after rejection and humiliation and being sold like livestock. Instead, she simply sat in silence and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. 3 Alpha Kings, a true mate bond. A 3-day journey to a territory that would become her new home, whether she wanted it or not. The tiny Omega who had been called cursed all her life was about to discover that some fates were inescapable, no matter how far you ran. The journey to Blackthorn Manor. The first inn they stopped at was nothing like the roadside establishments Serafina had occasionally glimpsed during her sheltered life in the Winterborn estate. This was a place built specifically to accommodate traveling alphas of status, with stone walls thick enough to muffle sounds and rooms large enough to house entire packs. The innkeeper took one look at the Blackthorn crest on the carriage and immediately began bowing and scraping, offering his finest suite without being asked. Cassian handled the arrangements with the cool efficiency of someone accustomed to command, while Dorian carried their limited luggage, and Lysander kept a careful hand on Serafina's lower back, guiding her through the busy common room. She could feel eyes on her. Every wolf in the establishment could scent what she was, unmated Omega, in the presence of 3 powerful alphas. The air practically crackled with speculation and barely suppressed curiosity. The suite they were shown to occupied the entire 3rd floor. It consisted of a large sitting room with a fireplace already burning, a bathing chamber with a tub big enough for 4 people, and a bedroom dominated by a bed that could easily accommodate 5. Serafina's pulse quickened at the sight of that bed. "You must be exhausted," Lysander said, his cool voice cutting through her rising panic. "The bathing chamber is through there. Take your time. We'll have food brought up." It was a reprieve, however temporary, and Serafina seized it gratefully. She disappeared into the bathing chamber and locked the door behind her, then leaned against it, breathing hard. This was real. This was happening. Tonight, these three legendary alphas would claim her body, would take her virginity, would bind her to them in ways she barely understood. The bath had already been drawn, steam rising from water that smelled of lavender, and something else, something that made her Omega instincts purr with contentment. Serafina stripped off the simple shift she'd been wearing since the market and sank into the heated water with a sigh. She had never been touched by a man, had never been kissed, never been caressed, never experienced anything beyond her own inexperienced explorations. Everything she knew about mating came from hushed conversations between Omega friends and the clinical explanations provided during her preparation for the bonding ceremony with Thaddeus, a ceremony that had ended in public rejection instead of private claiming. Serafina pushed the memory away and focused on washing. The soap provided was luxurious, scented with oils that left her skin soft and gleaming. She washed her hair thoroughly, working her fingers through the platinum strands until they shone like moonlight. When she finally emerged from the bath, she found a robe laid out on the counter, soft as silk and clearly expensive. She wrapped herself in it and took a moment to study her reflection in the mirror. Violet eyes stared back at her wide with anxiety and something else. Anticipation, maybe, or curiosity. The mate bond hummed in her chest, three distinct threads, pulling her toward the alphas waiting beyond the door. She couldn't hide in here forever. Serafina took a deep breath, gathered what remained of her courage, and opened the door. The sitting room had been transformed in her absence. The table was laden with food, roasted meats, fresh bread, cheeses, fruits, and wine. The three alphas had changed as well, now wearing simple shirts and trousers instead of their travel clothes. They looked more relaxed, more approachable, more dangerous. "Sit," Cassian said, gesturing to the table. "Eat, you'll need your strength." The comment made her blush, but Serafina moved to the table and sat. She was hungrier than she'd realized, having eaten nothing since a meager breakfast at the market. The food was excellent, and she found herself eating more than she intended while the alphas watched with satisfaction. "Better," Dorian said when she finally pushed her plate away. "Now, before anything else happens, we need to talk." Lysander poured wine into 4 glasses and handed one to Serafina. "You said you wanted us to explain everything, so we will. Ask your questions." Serafina wrapped both hands around the wine glass, grateful for something to hold on to. "What does claiming actually involve? I know the basics, but you're a virgin who was rejected before her bonding ceremony could be completed," Cassian finished. "So you have theory, but no practical experience." "Yes." The three brothers exchanged glances, then Lysander spoke. "I'll explain. I'm the pack's high priest and chief healer. I've overseen hundreds of bonding ceremonies." He moved closer, sitting in the chair beside her. His ice blue eyes were gentle despite their coldness. "Claiming is both physical and spiritual. The physical aspect, you probably understand penetration, nodding, the exchange of fluids that helps establish biological compatibility." Serafina nodded, her cheeks burning. "The spiritual aspect is more complex," Lysander continued. "When an alpha claims an omega, there's a marking bite that creates a permanent bond. The bite releases certain compounds that bind your scent to ours and ours to yours. Every wolf who encounters you will know immediately that you're mated and to whom. And with 3 alphas, you'll bear 3 marks," Dorian said. "One from each of us. It's unusual but not unheard of in cases of shared mates. The marks will glow silver when the bond is strong, fade to scars when we're apart." "Does it hurt?" "The first penetration will hurt," Cassian said bluntly. "You're a virgin. There's no way around that. But we'll prepare you as thoroughly as possible, ensure you're aroused and ready, make the experience as pleasurable as we can." "And the bite, brief pain that transforms into pleasure," Lysander explained. "The compounds release trigger an endorphin response. Many omegas describe it as the most intense sensation they've ever experienced." Serafina took a long drink of wine. "And the nodding." "Ah," Dorian's smile was knowing. "That's the part that terrifies most virgin omegas." He leaned forward, his amber eyes intense. "When an alpha approaches climax, a gland at the base of his shaft swells. This is the knot. It locks inside the omega's body, preventing separation for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the strength of the bond." "It sounds impossible. I'm small, and you're all massive." Cassian's tone was dry. "Yes, but omega physiology is designed for this. Your body will stretch to accommodate us. It may feel impossible at first, but I promise you it's not." "We'll go slowly," Lysander added, "one at a time. Give you time to adjust between each claiming. By the time all 3 of us have taken you, your body will understand what's expected of it." Serafina's hands were shaking. She set down the wine glass before she could spill it. And then after tonight, then we continue the journey to Blackthorn Manor, Cassian said. You'll have 2 more days to recover before we arrive at our territory. Time to adjust to the temporary bond to feel what it's like to be connected to us. The permanent bond comes later, Dorian added, when you're ready, when you've learned to trust us, when you can accept our marks willingly rather than as obligation. It was more consideration than she'd expected, more gentleness than most purchased Omegas received. Seraphina looked at each of them in turn, trying to reconcile the legendary Blackthorn Kings with these alphas who spoke to her of patience and preparation. Why me? The question had been burning in her mind since the market. You're kings. You could have any Omega you wanted. Why pay a fortune for a rejected, supposedly cursed Omega? The 3 brothers went very still. Then Cassian spoke, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was sharing something significant. 200 years ago, the moon goddess appeared to our father in a vision. She told him his sons would wait centuries for their true mate, but when she finally appeared, she would be marked by the moon itself. Pale as starlight, eyes the color of twilight bearing the blessing of the divine disguised as a curse. Seraphina's breath caught. My coloring. Your coloring, Lysander confirmed. We've been searching for you our entire lives. When we heard about an Omega with platinum hair and violet eyes being sold at market, we came immediately. And when we saw you, Dorian continued, when we felt the mate bond snap into place with a force that nearly brought us to our knees, we knew. The wait was over. You're not cursed, Seraphina. You're blessed. You're ours. The certainty in their voices was absolute. They believed this completely, and the mate bond humming in her chest suggested they might be right. I'm frightened, she admitted quietly. We know, Cassian said, but we're going to make this good for you, I swear it. He stood and offered his hand. Seraphina looked at it for a long moment, then placed her smaller hand in his larger one. His fingers closed around hers warm and strong, and he drew her to her feet. Come, he said softly, let us show you what it means to be cherished. The bedroom seemed smaller than before, the massive bed now looming like an altar where she would be sacrificed to duty and biology. But when Cassian drew her close, when his hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness, some of her fear began to ease. May I kiss you, he asked, and the fact that he asked at all made something in her chest loosen. Yes. The first brush of his lips against hers was soft, almost tentative. He kissed her like she was precious, like she might break if he pressed too hard. Seraphina had never been kissed before, had nothing to compare this to, but instinct told her this was special. When he finally deepened the kiss, his tongue sliding against hers, she made a small sound of surprise that turned into pleasure. Cassian pulled back slightly, his silver eyes searching hers. Right. Yes, her voice was breathless. More. His smile was beautiful and terrifying. Greedy little Omega. We'll give you more. We'll give you everything. Dorian moved behind her, his hands settling on her waist. She was trapped between them now, Cassian in front and Dorian behind, their heat surrounding her, their sense overwhelming her senses. Lysander watched from beside the bed, his ice-blue eyes tracking every movement. The robe, Dorian murmured against her ear, his breath hot against her skin. May we remove it? Yes. The silk slithered to the floor, leaving her naked between them. Seraphina fought the urge to cover herself to hide from their hungry gazes. Cassian's hands traced her shoulders, her collarbones, the curve of her waist. Perfect, he breathed. Absolutely perfect. Dorian's hands joined his brother's, exploring her back, the curve of her spine, the swell of her hips. 4 hands on her body, learning her shape, and Seraphina felt heat beginning to pool low in her belly. On the bed, Cassian commanded gently. Lie back. Seraphina climbed onto the massive bed and settled against the pillows. The 3 alphas surrounded her, still clothed, while she lay naked and exposed. It should have made her feel vulnerable. Instead, the way they looked at her like she was the most desirable creature they'd ever seen made her feel powerful. We're going to touch you now, Lysander said, moving to sit beside her on the bed. Going to learn what makes you gasp and moan. If anything hurts or frightens you, you say so immediately. Understood. Understood. His cool fingers traced her collarbone, then lower, circling her breast without quite touching the sensitive peak. Seraphina arched involuntarily, seeking more contact, and Lysander's smile was knowing. Responsive, he observed. That's good. That will make this easier. Cassian settled on her other side, his hands mimicking his brother's movements. When both of them finally touched her breasts, simultaneously rolling the peaks between their fingers, Seraphina cried out at the intensity of sensation. Sensitive here, Cassian noted. We'll remember that. Dorian had positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his large hands wrapped around her ankles, spreading her legs gently but inexorably. Serafina's face burned as she was opened to his gaze completely exposed. Beautiful, Dorian said reverently, and already wet for us. Your body knows what it wants, even if your mind is still catching up. His fingers trailed up her inner thighs, getting closer and closer to her center. When he finally touched her there, one finger sliding through her folds, Serafina nearly came off the bed. Easy, he soothed. I'm just exploring, learning you. He circled that small bundle of nerves at her apex, and pleasure unlike anything Serafina had ever experienced shot through her body. She'd touched herself before, of course, but this was different. This was overwhelming. That's your pearl, Lysander explained, his cool voice a counterpoint to the heat building in her body. The center of your pleasure. When stimulated properly, it will make you climax. Climax, she could barely form words. You'll see, Cassian promised. Dorian's fingers continued their exploration, sliding lower, circling her entrance. This is where we'll claim you, where our knots will lock. It feels impossibly small right now, I know, but your omega body will stretch. He pressed one finger inside just to the first knuckle, and Serafina gasped at the foreign sensation. It didn't hurt, but it felt strange, invasive. Breathe, Lysander instructed. Relax your muscles. Fighting it only makes it worse. Serafina tried to breathe, tried to relax. Dorian worked his finger deeper slowly, giving her time to adjust. When he was fully seated inside her, he held still. How does that feel? Strange, not painful, just full. That's one finger, Cassian said. Eventually you'll take all of us, but we'll work up to it. Dorian began to move his finger in and out, establishing a rhythm. After a few moments, he added a second finger, stretching her further. The burn was sharper now, but not unbearable. Good girl, he praised, taking it so well. Lysander's mouth found her breast, sucking the peak between his lips. Cassian claimed her mouth in another kiss, swallowing her moans. Dorian's fingers worked inside her while his thumb found that sensitive pearl, and sensation overwhelmed thought. The pleasure built like a wave higher and higher until Serafina thought she might shatter from the intensity. Her body tensed, reaching for something she didn't understand but desperately needed. That's it, Dorian encouraged. Let go, come for us. The wave crested and broke. Serafina's entire body convulsed as her first orgasm crashed through her, pleasure radiating from her core in pulses that seemed to last forever. She heard herself crying out, heard the alphas murmuring praise, but couldn't process anything beyond the overwhelming sensation. When she finally came back to herself, she was trembling and gasping. Dorian's fingers had stilled inside her, but he hadn't withdrawn them yet. One, Cassian said with satisfaction. We'll give you at least 2 more before the actual claiming. Make sure you're as ready as possible. I can't, Serafina protested weakly. That was too much. I can't do that again. You can, Lysander assured her. And you will. Your body is capable of far more pleasure than you realize. He was right. Over the next hour, they brought her to climax twice more, using fingers and mouths and techniques she hadn't known existed. By the time they finally began to undress themselves, Serafina was boneless and oversensitized, floating in a haze of endorphins. But when Cassian finally stood naked before her, when she saw the full reality of what she was expected to accommodate, fresh fear cut through the pleasure haze. He was massive. All of them were. Even soft, they were larger than anything she could have imagined. And at the base of each shaft, she could see the gland that would swell into a knot. We don't fit, she whispered. There's no way. Cassian climbed onto the bed, settling between her spread thighs. His silver eyes held hers with an intensity that made escape impossible. We fit. Your omega body knows it, even if your mind doesn't believe it yet. Trust me, Serafina. Trust the bond. He positioned himself at her entrance, the broad head of his shaft pressing against her opening. Despite all the preparation, despite the 3 orgasms, Serafina tensed. Breathe, Cassian instructed. Look at me, stay with me. She locked eyes with him as he began to push inside. The stretch was immediate and intense, far more than Dorian's fingers had been. Serafina whimpered and Cassian paused. Too much? No, just different. Keep going. He pushed deeper, inch by careful inch. Serafina felt the exact moment he encountered her virgin barrier, felt him pause as he registered what he was about to do. This will hurt, he warned. I'm sorry. Then he thrust forward, tearing through the barrier in one smooth motion. Pain lanced through her sharp and bright, and Serafina cried out. Tears leaked from her eyes as Cassian held himself perfectly still, buried to the hilt inside her. I know, he murmured, his voice gentle despite the strain she could see on his face. I know it hurts, but the worst is over now. Just breathe through it. Lysander was there, wiping away her tears, murmuring soothing words. Dorian's hands found hers, lacing their fingers together. The three of them surrounded her with comfort as the sharp pain gradually faded to a deep ache. Better, Cassian asked after a long moment. Serafina tested the sensation, tried moving her hips slightly. The ache was still there, but beneath it was something else. A fullness that felt right somehow, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Better, she confirmed. Cassian began to move, withdrawing slowly before pressing back in. Each thrust sent sensation radiating through her body, pleasure and discomfort mixing in ways she couldn't separate. His knot began to swell, pressing against her entrance with increasing insistence. Here it comes, he warned. The knot. It's going to feel like too much, but your body can take it. Breathe. On his next thrust, the knot popped inside her, stretching her impossibly wider. Serafina screamed, overwhelmed by the sensation. She was so full she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel Cassian locked deep inside her, his knot preventing any possibility of separation. And then his teeth found the junction of her neck and shoulder, and he bit down. The pain was sharp but brief, immediately followed by a rush of sensation that made her previous orgasms pale in comparison. Chemicals flooded her system, endorphins and bonding compounds, and things she had no name for. The mate bond between them flared silver and bright, solidifying into something real and permanent. Cassian groaned against her throat as his release pulsed inside her, hot and overwhelming. Serafina could feel every spurt, could feel her body accepting what he gave, and somewhere in the midst of all that sensation, she climaxed again, her inner muscles clamping down on his knot. They were locked together, bound by biology and chemistry, and something far deeper. Cassian's mark on her shoulder began to glow silver, visible even in the candlelight. One, he panted, still buried inside her. You survived your first alpha, claiming Serafina. You're stronger than you know. But there were still two more waiting, and the night was far from over. 20 minutes passed before Cassian's knot finally began to recede. Serafina felt every inch of the withdrawal, her body protesting the loss of fullness, even as relief flooded through her that the impossible stretch was ending. When he finally slipped free, she couldn't suppress the whimper that escaped her lips. Shh, Cassian soothed, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. You did beautifully. So perfect for us. The mark on her shoulder throbbed with a pleasant warmth, and Serafina could feel something new humming in her chest. A thread connecting her to Cassian, faint but undeniable, pulsing with his emotions. Satisfaction, pride, possessiveness, and beneath it all, something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. But there was no time to process any of it because Dorian was already moving into position. My turn, he said, his amber eyes burning with hunger that had only intensified watching his brother claim her. But we're going to do this differently. Serafina's eyes widened. Differently how? Turn over, Dorian instructed, his hands already guiding her onto her stomach. On your knees, little mate. I want to take you from behind. The position made her feel vulnerable in an entirely new way. She couldn't see Dorian's face, couldn't read his expression, or anticipate his movements. All she could do was kneel there with her hips raised and wait for him to claim her. Lysander moved to sit in front of her, his ice-blue eyes gentle as he cupped her face. Look at me, Serafina. Stay grounded. Dorian can be intense, but he won't hurt you more than necessary. More than necessary, she repeated weakly. Dorian's hands gripped her hips, his touch firm to the point of bruising. I'm not as patient as Cassian, he admitted, his voice rough. I've been holding back for hours watching him claim you, and my control is hanging by a thread. This might be rougher than your first time. Serafina felt him position himself at her entrance, already slick from Cassian's claiming and her body's continued arousal. The angle was different, the penetration deeper, and when Dorian thrust forward in one powerful motion, she screamed into the pillow. Lysander pressed beneath her face. Breathe, Lysander commanded, his cool hand stroking her hair. He's all the way in now, the hard part is over. But Dorian didn't give her time to adjust the way Cassian had. He withdrew and thrust again, establishing a punishing rhythm that sent shockwaves through her oversensitized body. Each impact drove her forward, and only Lysander's steadying hands kept her from collapsing. Too much, Serafina gasped. I can't. Yes, you can. Dorian growled, his fingers digging into her hips, hard enough to leave marks. Your Omega body was made to take this, made to take all of us however we want you. And right now I want you like this, desperate and overwhelmed and completely at my mercy. His words should have frightened her. Instead, they sent a spike of heat straight to her core. Her body responded to the dominance in his voice, to the claiming instinct driving his rough treatment, and she felt herself growing wetter despite the discomfort. That's it. Dorian praised, feeling her body's response. Stop fighting it. Let your Omega nature accept what your Alpha is giving you. The pleasure built differently this time, sharper and more intense than with Cassian. Dorian's knot began to swell, pressing insistently with each thrust, and Seraphina knew what was coming, but still wasn't prepared when it finally locked inside her. The sensation was overwhelming. From this angle, the knot felt even larger, stretching her in ways that seemed impossible. She sobbed into the pillow, tears streaming down her face, and Lysander was there, immediately wiping them away with gentle fingers. Almost done, he murmured. Just the mark now, and then you can rest. Dorian leaned over her back, his chest pressing against her spine, and Seraphina felt his teeth graze the unmarked side of her neck. The bite, when it came, was harder than Cassian's, had been more possessive, and the rush of bonding chemicals that flooded her system was correspondingly stronger. A second thread snapped into place in her chest, connecting her to Dorian. His emotions poured through the bond, fierce satisfaction, primal claiming instinct, and underneath it all, a protectiveness so intense it took her breath away. Dorian's release followed immediately, hot and overwhelming, and the sensation triggered Seraphina's own climax. She came with a scream that echoed off the stone walls, her body convulsing around Dorian's knot as pleasure and pain merged into something transcendent. Two, Dorian panted against her marked shoulder. 2 alpha knots, 2 marks, 1 more to go, and you'll be completely ours. Seraphina couldn't form words. She could only kneel there, locked to Dorian, feeling his knot pulsing inside her and his mark burning on her neck. 2 threads hummed in her chest, now connecting her to 2 impossibly powerful alphas who had claimed her body and were slowly claiming everything else as well. When Dorian's knot finally receded after what felt like an eternity, Seraphina collapsed forward onto the bed. Every muscle in her body ached. Every nerve felt scraped raw. She couldn't possibly survive another claiming. But Lysander was already there, gathering her into his arms with surprising gentleness. He carried her to the center of the massive bed and laid her down on soft pillows, then settled beside her with his platinum hair gleaming in the candlelight. "You're doing so well," he praised, his cool fingers tracing patterns on her overheated skin. "But we're not quite finished yet." "I can't," Seraphina whispered. "Please, Lysander, I can't take any more." You can," he assured her, his ice blue eyes holding hers with calm certainty. "And this time will be different. Cassian was methodical, Dorian was primal. But I'm going to be slow and gentle, and I'm going to explain what's happening as we complete the bond." He positioned himself between her thighs, and Seraphina noticed that despite his words about gentleness, he was just as large as his brothers, just as capable of overwhelming her small frame. "The claiming bond has 3 components," Lysander explained, his voice taking on the lecture tone of a high priest conducting a ceremony. "Physical, which we've been establishing. Emotional, which forms through the marks. And spiritual, which requires all 3 of us to complete the circuit." He entered her slowly, so slowly she could feel every inch of his length as he filled her. The stretch was familiar now, her body beginning to understand what was expected of it, and though it still burned, the pain was less sharp than before. "Right now you have 2 marks," Lysander continued, his movements measured and controlled, even as his jaw clenched with the effort of restraint. 2 threads connecting you to 2 alphas. But the bond isn't complete until all 3 marks are in place, until the power can flow in a complete circle. "What power?" Seraphina managed to ask, though thinking was difficult with him moving inside her. Lysander's eyes flashed with something that might have been excitement. "You'll see." He made love to her with a reverence that contrasted sharply with Dorian's rough claiming and even Cassian's controlled passion. Every thrust was deliberate, aimed to bring her pleasure rather than simply take his own. His hands worshipped her body, finding sensitive places his brothers had missed, and within minutes, Seraphina felt impossible pleasure building again. "That's it," Lysander encouraged. "One more time. Come for me, little mate. Come for your 3rd alpha." His knot began to swell, and this time Seraphina didn't fight it. She let her body accept the intrusion, felt herself stretch to accommodate him, and when the knot finally locked into place, she was ready for the mark that would complete the bond. Lysander's teeth sank into the base of her throat, right where neck met shoulder, and the world exploded into light. Silver radiance burst from all 3 marks simultaneously, so bright that it illuminated the entire bedroom like midday sun. Power surged through Seraphina's body, ancient and overwhelming and utterly beyond her understanding. She could feel all 3 alphas now, their emotions, their thoughts, their very essences connected to hers through threads that blazed with silver fire. And beneath it all, she felt something else, something vast and divine and impossibly old pressing against her consciousness like a presence observing from a great distance. The moon goddess herself bearing witness to what had just been completed. Lysander's release triggered her final climax, and Seraphina came with a sob that was equal parts pleasure and awe. The power peaked, crested, then slowly began to fade, leaving behind a warmth in her chest where the three threads now pulsed with steady, permanent light. The room returned to normal candlelight, but the marks on her shoulders and throat continued to glow faintly silver, visible proof of what she had become. Claimed, bonded, bound to three Alpha Kings by ties that could never be broken. When Lysander's knot finally receded and he withdrew, Seraphina lay boneless and trembling on the bed. She was marked in three places, claimed in every way that mattered, connected to three impossibly powerful alphas who now owned pieces of her soul. All three brothers moved then, working together with practiced coordination. Cassian brought warm water and soft cloths, cleaning her gently while murmuring praise. Dorian found healing salve and applied it to the marks and the places where their rough handling had left bruises. Lysander wrapped her in the softest blankets she had ever felt and gathered her against his chest. "You survived," Cassian said, wonder in his voice. "3 alpha knots in one night, 3 claiming marks. The formation of a triple bond. You're extraordinary, Seraphina." "I don't feel extraordinary," she mumbled against Lysander's chest. I feel destroyed." "Your body will heal," Dorian assured her, settling on her other side so she was surrounded by alpha warmth. "By tomorrow, you'll barely feel the soreness. The marks will settle into scars that only glow when the bond is particularly strong, and the threads connecting us will become as natural as breathing." "What was that light?" Seraphina asked, remembering the silver radiance that had filled the room. "At the end, when Lysander marked me," the three brothers exchanged glances over her head, that silent communication flowing between them. "We're not entirely sure," Lysander admitted, "but I suspect it has something to do with what you are, what the moon goddess marked you to be." "Moon-blessed," Seraphina whispered, remembering the words from the market announcement. "Perhaps," Cassian agreed, "or perhaps it's simply the power of a true mate bond fully formed. There hasn't been a documented case of triplet alphas claiming a single omega in over 300 years. We're in uncharted territory." Seraphina wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what had just happened to her and what it meant for her future. But exhaustion was pulling at her like a tide, dragging her down into darkness despite her attempts to stay conscious. "Sleep," Lysander commanded gently. "We'll still be here when you wake. We'll always be here now. The bond ensures it." The last thing Seraphina felt before sleep claimed her was the warmth of 3 alpha bodies surrounding her, the steady pulse of 3 threads in her chest, and the faint silver glow of 3 marks that proclaimed to any who saw them exactly who she belonged to. The tiny omega who had been called cursed all her life had survived the impossible and been transformed into something new, something powerful, something that made ancient magic respond and divine beings take notice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new complications to navigate. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of 3 Alpha Kings who had claimed her as their true mate, Seraphina Winterborn felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Safe. Morning came with soft golden light filtering through the window shutters. Seraphina woke slowly, her body registering a deep, pleasant ache that reminded her of everything that had happened the night before. She was still surrounded by alpha warmth, Cassian pressed against her back, Dorian's arm draped across her waist, and Lysander's hand resting possessively on her hip. The marks on her shoulders and throat throbbed with a gentle warmth, and when she concentrated, she could feel the threads connecting her to each of them. Cassian's steady presence, Dorian's banked intensity, Lysander's cool observation. They were hers now as surely as she was theirs. Cassian stirred first, his silver eyes opening to find her awake. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually stern expression into something that made her heart skip. "Good morning, mate," he murmured, the word carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. "How do you feel?" Seraphina took inventory of her body. Sore, yes, but not damaged. Marked, but not broken. Changed, but perhaps not diminished. "I feel," she said slowly, testing the truth of her words even as she spoke them, "like I survived something I didn't think was possible, and I'm still here." "You're still here," Cassian confirmed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "And you're ours. Completely and permanently ours." The possessiveness in his tone should have frightened her. Instead, it settled something restless in her chest. She had been rejected, sold, purchased like property. But these alphas had claimed her not as property, but as mate, had marked her not to degrade, but to cherish, had bound themselves to her as surely as they'd bound her to them. It wasn't the future she had imagined. It wasn't the life she had chosen. But perhaps, just perhaps, it might be something worth having. Dorian and Lysander woke in quick succession, and all three alphas seemed content to simply hold her for a long moment, as if reassuring themselves that the night before had been real. Finally, Cassian spoke. We should continue the journey soon. 2 more days to Blackthorn Manor, where you'll meet the pack and begin your new life as our queen. Queen. The title still felt foreign, impossible for someone who had been called cursed and defective mere days ago. But as Seraphina looked at the 3 marks glowing faintly on her skin, felt the 3 threads pulsing steadily in her chest, she realized that impossible seemed to be becoming her new normal. The rejected Omega had become a claimed mate. The cursed bloodline had been revealed as blessed. And the tiny body that shouldn't have survived 3 alpha knots had not only endured but emerged stronger. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited at Blackthorn Manor, Seraphina would face them as she had faced everything else. With dignity, with courage, and now with 3 impossibly powerful alphas standing beside her. The journey was far from over. But for the first time since her rejection, Seraphina allowed herself to hope that the destination might be worth the painful path that had led her here. 3 months later, Blackthorn Manor. 3 months had passed since that first night at the inn, and Seraphina Blackthorn. She still wasn't entirely used to her new name, stood before the floor-length mirror in the royal chambers studying her reflection with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The Omega staring back at her bore little resemblance to the broken girl who had been rejected at her own bonding ceremony. That Seraphina had been hollow-eyed and defeated, marked by shame, and convinced she was cursed. This Seraphina stood tall and confident, her platinum hair swept up in an elaborate style befitting a queen. The 3 marks on her shoulders and throat had faded to silvery scars that only glowed when her bond with the triplets strengthened, which was often. She wore a deep blue gown that complemented her violet eyes, and around her throat hung the Blackthorn royal insignia, a silver wolf wreathed in moonlight. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the mirror. It was the way she carried herself now. The way she walked through the manor's halls with purpose rather than fear. The way pack members bowed not out of mere obligation, but genuine respect. The way she had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of transformation. The triplets had been true to their word, treating her not as purchased property, but as their equal partner. They had taught her pack politics, combat basics, healing techniques. She sat in on council meetings, and her opinions were not only heard but valued. More than that, she had found purpose. The Omega welfare programs she had proposed were now thriving throughout the Northern Territories. No Omega would be sold without consent. No rejection would go without consequences, and support systems existed for those in crisis. She had transformed from victim to advocate, from powerless to influential. And tonight, everything would change again. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, and Cassian stepped inside, his silver eyes warming as they found her. "You look magnificent," he said, crossing the room to press a kiss to her temple. "But then you always do." Seraphina leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady pulse of their bond in her chest. Over the months, she had learned to read the threads connecting her to each brother. Cassian's was solid and reassuring like granite beneath her feet. Dorian's burned hot and fierce, a constant flame. Lysander's was cool and soothing, like water over stone. "Nervous about tonight?" Cassian asked, his hands settling on her waist. "Yes," she admitted. There was no point lying when he could feel her emotions through the bond anyway. "What we're attempting has never been done before. What if my body can't—" "Your body can," Cassian interrupted firmly. "We've been preparing for weeks. You've taken us individually dozens of times. You've taken 2 of us together successfully. Tonight is simply the final step." Tonight was the night they would attempt what had been shown in that first vision 3 months ago, the cold open that had started this entire story. All 3 brothers claiming her simultaneously, their knots locking together in an act that should be impossible, but that the mate bond made inevitable. The triple penetration that would complete their bond permanently and irrevocably. "And if the power surge happens again?" Seraphina asked, remembering the silver light that had exploded during Lysander's claiming that first night. "Last time nearly brought down the inn." "This time we're prepared," Cassian assured her. "Lysander has warded the room. Whatever power emerges will be contained and channeled safely." As if summoned by his name, Lysander appeared in the doorway, his platinum hair gleaming in the candlelight. "The preparations are complete. The room is ready whenever you are." Dorian arrived moments later, his amber eyes burning with barely restrained hunger. "I've been ready for months," he growled. "Waiting for this has been torture." Despite her nervousness, Seraphina smiled. The bond between all four of them had deepened significantly over the past months. What had started as obligation and biological imperative had transformed into genuine affection and trust. She loved them, all three of them, differently but equally. And tonight she would bind herself to them in the most complete way possible. Then let's not wait any longer, Serafina said, lifting her chin with the confidence she had earned. I'm ready. The claiming chamber. They had prepared one of the manor's most secure rooms for this. The massive bed had been specially constructed to handle the weight and force of 3 alpha bodies and 1 omega. The walls were inscribed with ancient runes that Lysander had spent weeks researching and preparing. Candles burned in every corner, their flames steady, despite the power already beginning to gather in the air. The mate bonds between all four of them hummed with anticipation, pulling tighter with each passing moment. Serafina stood in the center of the room as the 3 brothers circled her slowly, their eyes tracking every movement. The familiar dance of claiming had become ritual over the months, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt momentous. We're going to take our time, Cassian said, his voice carrying the authority of a king but tempered with tenderness. Prepare you as thoroughly as possible. Make sure you're ready. I trust you, Serafina replied simply and felt a surge of emotion through all 3 bonds. Those 3 words meant everything after how they had started. They undressed her slowly, reverently, each piece of clothing removed with careful attention. When she stood naked before them, they paused to simply look, their appreciation evident in every heated gaze. 3 months, Dorian said, his voice rough, and you still take my breath away every single time. The preparation was extensive. They used every technique they had learned about her body over the past months, every touch calibrated to bring maximum pleasure. Lysander's cool fingers found the spots that made her gasp. Cassian's controlled precision drove her higher. Dorian's passionate intensity pushed her over the edge again and again. By the time they deemed her ready, Serafina had climaxed 4 times and was floating in a haze of pleasure and endorphins. Her body was slick and ready, her channel already beginning to expand in anticipation of what was coming. Remember, Lysander said as they positioned themselves, if it's too much, if you need us to stop, you say the word. We stop immediately. I remember, Serafina assured him. They had discussed this extensively, had practiced different configurations, had built trust through dozens of intimate encounters. This was the culmination of everything they had worked toward. Lysander positioned himself beneath her first, his cool length sliding into her slick channel easily after months of practice. Serafina settled onto him with a sigh of pleasure, the familiar fullness, welcome and comfortable. Then Dorian moved behind her, his hands gripping her hips as he positioned himself at her rear entrance. They had practiced this too, though less frequently. The burn as he pushed inside was intense but not unbearable, and Serafina breathed through it as he worked himself deeper. That's 2, Cassian said, moving to position himself in front of her. Now comes the impossible part. 2 was already overwhelming. Serafina could feel both of them inside her, their lengths separated by only the thinnest barrier of tissue. She felt impossibly full, stretched to her limits. And then Cassian began to push into the same channel where Lysander was already buried. Oh gods! Serafina gasped as the pressure built to something beyond comprehension. I can't, there's no room, breathe, all 3 commanded in unison, their voices blending into harmony. Your Omega body was made for this. Trust the bond. Trust us. Trust yourself. Cassian pushed deeper, his shaft sliding alongside Lysander's, stretching Serafina in ways that seemed anatomically impossible. She sobbed with the overwhelming sensation, tears streaming down her face as her body struggled to accommodate what they were demanding. Please, she gasped, unsure if she was begging them to stop or to continue. And then something shifted. Her Omega nature surged forward, responding to the needs of her alphas, and her body began to change, to expand, to accept the impossible. Cassian slid home completely, and Serafina screamed. 3 massive bodies pinned her against silk sheets exactly as the vision had shown. 3 alpha lengths buried deep inside her small frame, their knots beginning to swell simultaneously. The pressure was indescribable. Serafina could feel all 3 of them, every inch, every pulse, every breath. The bonds between them blazed like stars, pulling tighter and tighter until she thought they might merge into a single entity. Now, Lysander commanded, and all 3 began to move. The coordination required was incredible. They moved as one being, their shared triplet bond, allowing them to synchronize perfectly. Each thrust sent shockwaves through Serafina's body, pleasure and pain merging into something transcendent. Their knots swelled larger, locking all 3 inside her simultaneously. The fullness was beyond anything she had experienced, beyond anything she thought possible. She was completely filled, utterly, claimed, absolutely owned by three alphas who had become her entire world. And then the power came. Silver light exploded from Seraphina's skin exactly as it had 3 months ago, but this time it was 1,000 times stronger. The entire chamber flooded with radiance so bright it seemed to burn away reality itself. The ancient runes on the walls flared to life, containing and channeling the massive surge of energy. Seraphina felt herself lifted beyond her body, beyond the physical realm entirely. She stood in a place of pure silver light, and before her materialized a figure of impossible beauty. The moon goddess herself, no longer just a distant presence, but fully manifest. "My daughter," the goddess said, her voice like music and thunder combined, "you have completed what was prophesied. The moon-blessed bloodline lives again." "What am I?" Seraphina asked, her voice echoing strangely in this place between worlds. "You are the first moon-blessed Omega born in 300 years, the goddess explained. Your coloring was not a curse but a mark of divine favor. Your rejection was necessary to bring you to your true mates. Everything that happened was part of a larger design. The suffering," Seraphina's voice hardened. "The humiliation that was all intended. The suffering was inflicted by cruel men who will face judgment," the goddess replied. "But from that suffering you found strength. From rejection you discovered your worth. From being broken, you learned to rebuild yourself into something magnificent." The goddess reached out, touching Seraphina's forehead with one luminous finger. Knowledge flooded through her understanding of her gifts, her purpose, her destiny. "You will bear 3 children, the goddess continued, triplets, one from each of your mates. They will inherit both alpha power and moon-blessed gifts. They will transform the northern territories and bring an age of prosperity and justice." "And if I don't want this destiny," Seraphina challenged, finding her voice even in the presence of divinity. "If I choose my own path," the goddess smiled, and it was kind rather than imperious. "You already chose your path the moment you stood up at that rejection ceremony. The moment you walked 10 miles in the snow rather than surrender to despair. The moment you negotiated terms with 3 Alpha Kings instead of simply submitting. Your strength, your courage, your refusal to be broken, those were never part of any plan. Those were entirely you." The vision began to fade, reality reasserting itself. "Live well, my daughter," the goddess said as she disappeared. "Love fiercely. Fight for justice. And know that you were never cursed, you were always blessed." Seraphina crashed back into her body to find all 3 alphas releasing simultaneously, their knots locked impossibly tight inside her, their marks on her throat and shoulders blazing with silver fire. Her own climax hit like a tsunami, pleasure so intense it bordered on pain, wave after wave, until she thought she might shatter from the force of it. The light slowly faded, returning the room to normal candlelight, but the marks remained bright, glowing with constant silver radiance, now instead of fading to scars. The bond was complete, permanent, unbreakable. When the knots finally receded 30 minutes later, and the 3 brothers carefully withdrew, Seraphina collapsed onto the silk sheets, boneless and trembling. Every muscle ached, every nerve sang. She felt utterly destroyed and completely reborn. "That," Dorian panted, "was the most intense experience of my 200-year life." "Agreed." Cassian managed his usual composure, completely shattered. Lysander simply pulled Seraphina into his arms, holding her as if she were infinitely precious, which she supposed she was. "I saw her," Seraphina whispered, "the moon goddess. She showed me what's coming." "Tell us," Cassian commanded gently, and she did. She told them about the prophecy about the triplets she would bear, about the future that awaited them all. 6 months later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of Blackthorn Manor, her hand resting on her swollen belly, where 3 heartbeats fluttered in perfect synchronization. 6 months pregnant with triplets, one from each mate, confirmed by healers who were still amazed by the biological miracle. The Northern Territory spread before her, transformed in the months since her arrival. Laws had changed. Omegas had rights now. The council had been reformed to include Omega representatives. Justice had been served. Thaddeus Ashcroft had attempted one final play for power 3 months ago, challenging the Blackthorn King's authority and demanding Seraphina be examined for witchcraft. The confrontation had been public and brutal. Seraphina had faced him before the assembled council, her marks glowing silver, her power evident for all to see. She had detailed every cruelty, every manipulation, every crime he had committed. And when he had tried to use alpha dominance to force her submission, she had pushed back with moon-blessed power that brought him to his knees. The council had voted unanimously for his banishment. He was forbidden from ever setting foot in the Northern Territories again, his lands and titles stripped, his name disgraced. Justice finally had been served. Now Seraphina stood as queen respected and valued, carrying the next generation of Blackthorn rulers. The rejected Omega had become the most powerful female in the territories. The cursed bloodline had been revealed as blessed. The tiny body that shouldn't have survived had not only endured but flourished. 3 sets of arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the warmth of her mates. "What are you thinking about?" Cassian asked, his hand joining hers on her belly. "About how far we've come," Seraphina replied softly. "About how something that started so wrong became so right." "Do you ever regret it?" Dorian asked. "Wish you could go back and choose differently?" Seraphina considered the question seriously. The rejection had been agony. The market had been humiliating. The first claiming had been overwhelming. But every terrible moment had led her here to this place of love and purpose and power. "No," she said finally, "because choosing differently would mean not having this, not having you, not having our children, not having the strength I discovered in myself. The moon goddess was right. I was never cursed. I was always blessed. I just couldn't see it yet." The 3 marks on her body glowed brighter, the bonds pulsing with shared emotion. Love, devotion, gratitude, wonder. "We love you," Lysander said quietly. "More than we thought possible. You transformed us as much as we transformed you." "I love you too," Seraphina replied. "All 3 of you, equally, completely, forever." 3 voices responded in perfect unison, forever. As the sun set over the northern territories, painting the sky in shades of silver and gold, Seraphina Blackthorn Moon, blessed Omega Queen of the Royal Pack, mate to 3 Alpha Kings, allowed herself to feel the full weight of her happiness. She had been rejected, sold, purchased, and claimed. She had been broken down and built back up. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious. And now, with her mates beside her and their children growing within her, she stood ready to face whatever future the moon goddess had planned. The tiny Omega body that everyone said couldn't survive 3 Alpha knots had done more than survive. It had thrived, and this was only the beginning of the legend of Seraphina Blackthorn, the moon-blessed queen who changed the world.